Hello, today I wanted to go over a few things that will help us understand that things like the license and the birth certificate and vehicle registration were supposed to be paid originally by federal employees. Okay, so I guess the first thing that we need to understand is that the federal government and the laws in the Constitution, for the most part, are limited to the federal lands. When the federal government received annexed lands from the states, when the states joined the Union, the states had to agree to allow the federal government to make all laws for those federal lands. So when it says to the exclusion of the state, it's talking about the states not being allowed to make law for the federal lands, that only the federal government can make law for those lands. So what you have are the state, and then you have first, you have the state created by the people in the state. The state is created by people, okay? You have to have so many people, such a population before you could call yourself a state. So the people created the state. Now there's another state created by the federal government, which is a contract, but between the state and the feds. So I'm going to get into that a little bit later. So the people created the state, and then the state gave some lands to the federal government. And the federal government, in those contracts between the state and itself, which was really all the states combined. So the federal government is all the states combined, and then each individual state has a contract with the federal government to allow the federal government to have some lands in its state within the boundaries of it, so that it can make the necessary laws for those areas. Okay, so here's a map, and this is for Texas, and I know you can't really see it, but you can go to nationalatlas.gov, which is part of the U.S. Department of Interior, U.S. Geological Survey. But you can find one for your state, and it'll show you the areas of land where the government actually owns those lands. So we have the Bureau of Reclamation owning some lands, and on this it's like a couple of teeny tiny spots in Texas. There's not much land. Department of Defense for military posts, Fish and Wildlife Services, Forest Services, National Park Services. Okay, so those are the areas that the government would make laws for, the federal government would make laws for. Now originally, none of these reclamation, wilderness, forest, national park, none of those are in the Constitution. The only one that's in the Constitution is post for military purposes, which in the Constitution was defense with a C, not defense with an S the way they write it now. Defense with the S means Latin for vengeance. Defense with a C was Old French, which is Norse for fortification. And that is also in de Vattel's Law of Nations for fortifications. A good government fortifies itself because it's protecting the people. Okay, so even though you can't really see it, there's some little spots in here, and they're blue for Department of Defense. So the Department of Defense has some small areas in here, okay, for military posts. They also call them military reservations. They call them federal lands. They call them areas. They call them islands, inlets, alcoves. They call them a variety of different things. So when people were put on those federal lands, they had to acquire federal citizenship. Okay, so in the Constitution, you had originally just a citizen of the United States, which was a federal citizen. Later, the 14th Amendment, because there were contracts to create a legal state, which was something I'm going to get into in a minute, there came a state and federal citizen, so they kind of combined them. You could be a state citizen and a federal citizen, but they had to do that in the 14th Amendment because of the legal situation, which I'm getting ready to tell you about. So what I'm going to tell you is something totally against everything that you've ever been told in school, everything you've ever believed to be true about your standing with the federal government and the federal government's standing in our state and its authority and power and what it has authority and power over. It's going to sort of wipe the slate clean and give you a new perspective on things. And this perspective is written about in a government report. Okay, during the Eisenhower administration, he put together a team of people called a committee, and they wrote a report on the analysis of the Constitution, all the paperwork from each of the states, from the Attorney General's offices, and this was started in 1953. Part 1 was completed in 1956. Part 2 was completed in 1957. I have a military background, so I also, after I got out of the military, I went to college and learned regulatory enforcement, and I went back to work for the Department of Defense as a regulatory enforcement officer. So being such, I understood the various limits of what applied to who and on what lands. So having looked at that, I knew that off-post OSHA applied to certain people, on-post OSHA applied to certain people, on-post environmental, when I say on-post, I mean on military or federal lands, applied to certain people, off applied to other people, and that what was on-post didn't apply off-post, what was off-post could come on-post and apply, but it had to be by consent of the commander on post. They couldn't just come on post arbitrarily whenever they wanted, because it was separate. The jurisdictions were separate. The powers were separate, okay? So what most people don't understand, what I'm finding that most people have a difficult time understanding, is that the federal government is very, very limited. It's limited to where it can do what it does, okay? People think it can do all these things that are listed in the Constitution, but that's not true. It can also only do them on the lands specified, which were the lands given by the state to the federal government for defense purposes, okay? And that's in this report. And when it talks about citizenship, it's talking about originally in the Constitution, before the 14th Amendment, it's talking about the people who worked for the federal government. And if you go back and look at the early laws on citizenship, some of the first laws on citizenship, and you read it understanding that this was for the people from the state to become federal citizens, it takes on a whole new kind of life and meaning, and you really grasp a better understanding of everything that's going on. Some things to me never made sense, but then when I read the report, then things started falling in line and making a lot of sense. So now I feel like I really understand the role of the federal government and how they've expanded themselves. And every court, every government, every state, everything that has any kind of power will try to expand itself. It's like the old saying, give a weed a foot and it takes a yard. It's going to take up the whole backyard. Okay, so that's what governments do. That's what courts do. Anything with any kind of power, they're going to try to expand itself. It's going to say, well, we're not just limited here. We're not just limited to these federal lands. We're going to go all over the state, and we're going to do everything that we can, and we're going to take that little clause in the Constitution, we're going to expand it, we're going to say it means all these other things. And what this report is telling you, which is called jurisdiction over federal areas within the state, is that originally that wasn't the case. So a citizen of the United States was someone from the state who went to court, applied to become a citizen, and then was allowed to become a citizen on the federal lands. And at that point, their time started as far as having the qualifications for to be a member of the House of Representatives or the Senate. And a Senate, because they have more time as a citizen of the United States on the federal lands, that's working on the federal lands, then they had to have more years as a citizen so that they could qualify as a senior, which is what a senator is, because they are the ones that are supposed to advise the president. Okay, so the president has two offices. He has one as the executive of the United States of America, and he has one as commander-in-chief of the United States Land and Naval Forces. So when it says United States, that's telling me that United States means the federal lands, okay? Because the United States Land and Naval Forces are on federal lands. The navies have lands near the water. So even though it's a navy and it's off the land, they have posts on the land, and they have dock spaces and stuff so they can bring the ships in, and then the people are there on land. So they still have land in the states. If possible, some states are landlocked and there's not much of a navy in those places, but now our navies do a lot of weapons tests, and they have aircraft, so that allows them to also be in places that are landlocked. Okay, so when someone wanted to become a citizen, some of the first laws were that they had to have 2 years of good behavior. So a clerk was not required to be a citizen, but could work in a civil service, that's a civilian position on the military lands, okay? And after 2 years, then they could go back to the court in the state and apply for their citizenship. Their citizenship to start the clock on the federal citizenship. So they would go and apply to become a federal citizen, which is called citizen of the United States. And at that point in time, the clock would start, and then they would be able to meet the qualifications to become either a House of Representative member or a senator. So in my mind, because they're becoming citizens of the United States and they're on military lands working for military stuff, it appears to me that those would be military positions. So they would be officers in the military. And then the militia, originally they were called privates. So they would be called into service by the state, not the federal government. And then once they're called into service, they're listed as privates. And you can go back to the old records and you could see that any militia member during the Revolution and the Civil War were called privates, okay? They weren't enlisted the way we have them now. And then they have their various ranks and stuff. They were all just considered privates unless they were able to move up and become a citizen and get a commission and that kind of thing. Okay, so that's not to say that civil servants couldn't also be citizens of the United States, but in my mind, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because they make laws for the United States, because under Article 1, The Congress is to make laws for the United States, not the United States of America. Okay, so remember I said the president had two offices. The president is the executive of the United States of America, as well as the commander-in-chief of the United States Land and Naval Forces. Okay, so what's the difference? It appears to me that because of my military background, anytime you go on a military post, the executive officer is second in command, whereas the commander is first in command. So the president has two offices, executive and commander, but he's the executive of the United States of America, which tells me he's second in command of the state governments. Okay, so if we were at war and there was an enemy on our land, just like there was during the Revolutionary War, the president would take command of any state government that had fallen. Okay, so let's say Texas is overtaken by people who come from Mexico. Then the president becomes commander of the state because it's a line of succession. So if the governor is the commander or first in charge of the state and he's taken down and the legislators have run off and people are hiding or dying or getting taken prisoner, then from Washington, you still have the president, okay, who then becomes a temporary commander of the government of the state until the new government can be set in place, which, if you think about it, is a really great tactic to have because he's way over there. The president is way over there in Washington, and he can reconstitute the state from where he's at, which would make it more difficult for any enemy to get there to Washington and take down the state and the president in order to overtake a state. So that's a really good tactic, I think, a war tactic. Okay, so the Congress then makes laws for the federal areas because the federal areas are where the military are, the land and naval forces. We know that the United States and the land and naval forces are attached because it says so in the Constitution under Article 2, Section 2, where it says the president is commander-in-chief of the United States Land and Naval Forces. So those two things appear to go together, whereas in Article 2, Section 1, the president is the executive officer of the states, which is the United States of America. So you have each state, and then the states collectively are United States of America, and then you have the federal lands inside the states, okay, the federal lands inside the states, and then every state has federal lands in it, and those federal lands combined are United States for the purpose of military, okay, defense with a C, okay, fortifications, all right. Those are the two offices. Now let's look at Congress, Article 1. Congress shall have the power to make the laws for the federal lands, which are United States. Okay, that's in this. Now, back in the old days, the people understood this. It wasn't an issue. It wasn't a question about who is who and what is what. There's an old letter in a book that says, it's a letter from George Washington to a friend of his, and he's writing him saying that he's retiring from public service or service to the public as a citizen, and he's going to retire into quiet life as a private citizen, enjoying the quiet life on the Potomac River because that's where he lived. Okay, So outside of the federal government, we are private citizens. And we know that because whenever there was a war, the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, the states, and there's old newspaper articles that talk about this, the states would call the militia, okay? Their private citizens would be called up in defense of the United States of America, the states, the whole states collectively. And they would enter into the federal lands, okay? And they would get guns and weapons, and that's where the officers worked and lived and had their offices. That's where the messenger service would have their posts. So they would have messengers, which they were at the post offices. Posts are military. If you look up the word post, there's like 3 or 4 definitions, and they all have to do with messenger service, military stations, a stick in the ground, and that's what the federal government did, and that's what the states allowed. They allowed the federal government to come in and put sticks in the ground, call them posts, said that they were for military purposes, okay? So the legislators in the federal government were able to legislate, which is called exclusive legislative jurisdiction, only over those federal lands, okay? So it said to the exclusion of the state. So the state could not make laws for those lands because those lands were called United States for defense purposes, not states, okay? Not United States of America. So it was kind of like, here's the United States of America. They're going to take a little bit out, call it United States, and it was going to be for military purpose, defense of the country. That was the thing, right during the Revolutionary War. As a matter of fact, they called the army a state. So they used the word state liberally, okay? So in this report, jurisdiction over federal areas within the state, report of the Intercontinental Committee for the Study of Jurisdiction over Federal Areas within the States. This is part 2. It's 1957. Part 1 came out a year earlier, 1956. A text of the law of legislative jurisdiction. Okay, so it's taking apart the Constitution and it's trying to explain to you jurisdiction. What is jurisdiction? I have another video on that. For more detail, you can go watch that video. But jurisdiction with a capital J is not arbitrary. It's specific and defined. It means capital P, power, and capital A, authority, which are always capitalized in the Constitution. So if you get a Constitution that's true to the original text of the Constitution, power, law, legislation, okay, not sure about legislation. Power, law, authority is always defined or always uppercase in the Constitution. And the reason why is because it's not arbitrary. Arbitrary things are lowercase. Specific and defined things are uppercase. Okay? So this is a government report. It was printed by the government printing office. You could buy this back in 1957 for $1.25. The U.S. Government Printing Office, Washington, D.C. It actually has Washington 25 D.C. I don't know what that means. Maybe that was the address. For sale by the Superintendent of Documents. I looked at this a couple years ago, and it was available at that time in every single state's library, their capital library, okay? So you would have to go there and you couldn't check it out, but you could sit and read it. But now we have them online, like at archive, at hathitrust.org, archive.org. You can find these and you can sit and read them. Someone has gone through the effort of probably years ago, before we had all these websites, of retyping it and then putting it up online. So, okay, so now I'm going to show you what the report says about the people on the federal lands. Okay, now once you understand this, you're going to understand licenses and taxes and a bunch of other things that you need to understand to know that the government does not have power over you, and all those licensings and taxes and stuff are not for you, it's for them. Okay, so it says, Part 1, Chapter 1, Outline of Study. The instant study was occasioned by the denial of a group of children of federal employees residing on the grounds of a Veterans Administration hospital of the opportunity of attending public schools in the town in which the hospital was located. So, okay, it's using the example of the veterans hospitals because a lot of the nurses were civilians. Okay, a lot of the doctors were civilians. Our government wasn't big enough where now they employ tons and tons and tons of doctors, and they're all commissioned officers, and they get paid a ton of money, and they work on federal lands. They do also still have some civilian doctors that work on federal lands. Okay, so they used to live on federal lands because it says resides. Okay, so the people at this veterans hospital were working for the government on the federal lands. Okay, they lived there. That was where their homes were. Now, if you go to Leavenworth, Kansas, I had lived there for a while. They have a veterans hospital there. And back in 05, 06, 07, all the old buildings were still standing. All the old buildings from the Civil War era were still standing. And they had homes and barracks and the hospital. And so you could tell just by walking around that back in those days, they lived on the federal lands. Okay, so the doctors, the nurses, the people who were there in the hospitals, the veterans who had been injured in war, they all lived on the federal lands. Okay, so they had to be federal citizens. And if they weren't federal citizens, they had to acquire some citizenship. So when the Constitution was originally written, there wasn't a federal citizen who was also a state citizen. There was just a federal citizen. Now this what I'm about to tell you is where the turning point happens. Okay, so I'm trying to keep things in line so that we can better understand it. I tend to go down these rabbit holes and probably confuse people. So the people on the federal lands had children. They wanted to send their children to school, to the public schools in the state. But here's the thing, the people on the federal lands did not pay state taxes. That was completely separate, completely and totally separate. You had a federal citizen, and over here you had a state citizen, and they were oil and water. They didn't mix. Okay, that doesn't mean that they can't come off post and go shopping or whatever. That just meant that they lived there. It was almost like living in another country or in another state. You don't go from Texas and bus your kids up to Oklahoma to go to school because you don't pay taxes in Oklahoma. Oklahoma's going to say, okay, you can send your kids here, but you're going to have to pay. So that's what was happening here. The federal people on the federal lands wanted to send their children off post from that state into another state. So the federal lands were considered one state, and I'm not talking about an actual state the way you think about it, but it's a state of government, a standing, a place of where you're at, a different citizenship they had. So they couldn't leave the federal lands and just go into the state and use whatever services they wanted to in the state because they didn't pay taxes to the state. Okay, so in order for them to do that, they had to go to the courts. And they went to a local court, and the local state court said no. And I'm guessing the reason why is because they didn't pay taxes. They didn't pay for the service. So why do you get to come over here and use our stuff when you're not paying for it? So the federal government took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with the local court and said, no, you don't get to do that. You don't get to send your children off post because they paid on post the federal citizens paid taxes to the federal government. Okay, that was their federal taxes, taxes on the public salaries of officers and employees. Taxes were for the federal officers and employees. The state taxes were for state people, and they didn't mix. Okay, so an administrative decision against the children was affirmed by local courts. So the local courts told the federal citizens, no, you can't send your kids here. Finally, including the Supreme Court of the state, the decisions were based on the grounds that residents of the area in which the hospital was located were not residents of the state, since exclusive legislative jurisdiction over such area had been ceded by the state to the federal government, and therefore they were not entitled to privileges of the state residency. So they were not, at that time, state citizens. They changed it later, okay, and that came along with the creation of the contract state, the legal state, what we call the legal state. It's a creature of the federal government, okay? So exclusive legislative jurisdiction was ceded to the United States, to the federal government. It was given away over the federal lands inside the state so that the federal government could solely and by itself, Article 1, Congress has the power to legislate for the United States, the federal lands. Just replace the United States with federal lands. That's all you have to do to better understand the Constitution. The Congress shall make laws for the United States, the federal lands. Okay, why? Because the states ceded that jurisdiction. The states ceded the power and authority over those areas to the federal government for defense with the sea purposes. Okay, explains it beautifully right here. Those people did not live in the state. If they didn't live in the states, they couldn't be resident of the state. They couldn't be state citizens or private citizens. They were public officers and employees who resided on the federal lands and under the lawmaking authority of the federal government, okay? So I think we understand that, okay? I hope that we understand that. If not, go back and rewatch, okay? It talks about Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution of the United States. Okay, so if you have a Constitution, go look at Article 1, Section 8. There's a difference between regular English and legal English or logic, okay? There's different ways of saying things, different ways of listing things, different ways of deducing and inducing things, okay? Not really, but it's not taught in public schools so much. And I went over the reason for that in another video on family governments. So if you go to Article 1, Section 8, you'll see that it's just a list of things. A list of things that can be done, like taxes, imposts, excise, and it's got a dot colon, so a semicolon after each thing. So it's a list. Article 1, Section 8 is one long list. There's not a period until you get to the very last thing. Under, I think it's Clause 17 or 18, okay? That's where the period is. That means this is one sentence. It starts with a list, and then it tells you who, what, when, where, why, and how, okay? So what do we do, where, why, how, when, okay? For what purposes? So the list is for the things to be done on the federal lands. Taxes on federal lands, imposts on federal lands, commerce on federal lands, a citizen of the United States on federal lands, okay? Residents on federal lands, okay? Federal citizens on federal lands. Posts are federal lands, Post offices are for federal lands, the messenger services. Okay, now they did acquire another jurisdiction so that they could travel between the post within the state and outside the state to Washington and back, because they had to be able to communicate. So each state had to agree to cede some little amount of jurisdiction, like tiny, over some of the roads so that the federal people could travel. Okay, and to do that, they had to create these contracts. Okay, so let's go back to part 1, chapter 1 of the report, outline of study. Okay, so in order for the federal citizens, which were the officers and employees, receiving compensation, which is public money or federal money, they had to stay on the federal lands, but for them to be able to come off and use the services of the state and the federal government had to make an agreement. They already agreed, according to the Constitution, to what they were going to do on the federal lands, and that they would be the only person doing those things on the federal lands. So then the state would not be able to come in and tax federal citizens. Okay? Because the state did not use federal lands for any purpose, because they ceded them to the federal government. So they weren't going to use those lands. So in order to allow the federal citizens to come off the federal lands and use the services of the state, they had to have some contract in place. And each state has a right to make its own contracts with the states combined for federal purposes, which was the United States. So each state had the right to say what the federal government could do, what it couldn't do, how much it would pay, when it would pay, what it would pay for, what it would get in return for its payments. Okay, this created a new state. Okay, this created a legal state. The contracts created the state of whatever state what was the contract for, which was what the contract was for. So for Texas, where I'm at, you had Texas, which contracted with the United States to create state of Texas, which was a law enforcement office which administered the contracts between the state and the United States. And this state was called State of Texas. Okay, that's where your Secretary of State is, that's where your Attorney General is, and that's why in this report it says in part 1 at the very beginning, during the forward or preface, whatever it is, that the committee had to wait until all of the states' attorney generals made copies of all their papers and sent them all to Washington so that the committee could review the contracts between Texas and United States for state of Texas. Okay? I know this is kind of confusing, but when you go get your driver's license, it says state of Texas or state of Oklahoma. That's because you're doing it wrong. Okay? You're doing it wrong. That's for federal citizens, because the federal citizens, according to the contract, have to pay a tax. Now, if you go and look at the AmJur 2D, which is the American Jurisprudence, 2nd edition, it tells you, this is the set of books that lawyers, attorneys, and judges use to administer the laws, to administer the contracts, okay? So that they know what they can do and what they can't do according to the contracts between the state, which is Texas, and the United States for the allowance of the federal citizens to come off post and receive services off post in the state. So they would get a driver's license so that they would be paying the tax to use our roads. They would be paying the school to, and that money goes to the federal funds because they're paying the federal government, and then the federal government takes the money and sends it back to the states. That way they can send their children to our schools. They can send their like military officers, mostly men, when their wives became pregnant, they could send their wives to a hospital in the state to have the baby. Okay, so that baby then receives a birth certificate, and the birth certificate would show that that baby was actually born to federal citizens. So then it would be automatically given a legal name, which is a fiction, because it had now rights to the federal lands, to living on the federal lands. And when that child needed some service, hospital service, or school services or whatever, it would take its birth certificate off the federal lands into the state. And so the state would know that's a federal citizen. I have to charge back the federal government the tax for this child, okay? Or the federal government would then know it would have to pay money to that school or the state for that child, okay? So I hope this is not confusing. I'll tell you a story. When I was in the military, I went through some things, and I became a disabled veteran when I left the military. Whenever I became a disabled veteran, I was still in some ways attached to the federal government, okay? And I still am. So after I left the military and was a disabled veteran at a certain percentage rate, I became pregnant. I became pregnant as a private citizen, but entitled to services from the federal government, okay? So when I became pregnant, I couldn't go to the Veterans Hospital to have the baby because they didn't have that service there at the Veterans Hospital. They don't have enough female veterans needing that service, okay? So what they did was they had a contract with one of the hospitals near where I lived, so that when I went in to have my baby, the federal government paid for it. Now, I had a friend or a friend of a friend who they had their baby after me, a couple years after me, and they had to pay several $1,000s when they had their baby because she was not a veteran. So there was no contract between the federal government and the state to supply her with services, whereas there was between the federal government and the state to supply me with a service because I was a disabled veteran. So after we had our baby, my hospital bill was like $20, which was just the stuff that the VA wouldn't pay for. I don't know what it was, the gauze or something. So when a woman from the federal government, let's say she's the wife of a military person, she becomes pregnant and she goes off post to have her baby because there's a contract to supply that service to her because the federal lands don't have that service. So she will go off the post to have her baby in a state hospital, and the federal government would pay it. But she would need to let them know that her baby was also going to receive federal money for the care of that child. So the hospital would receive money for her and her care, and also receive money for the baby's care, right? So that baby would be issued a birth certificate, and that birth certificate would follow the child, so that that child would always be known until the age of 18 that he would be able to receive federal services. So when the child becomes 5 years old or so, and he needs to go to school, he has to take his birth certificate to the school. Now, state people are not supposed to have to do that because we already pay taxes. We already pay for everything. We're in the state. We're state citizens. We're private citizens, whatever you want to call it. So we're already paying for that. So if the state wants to issue a birth certificate, that's one thing. But when we claim to be a citizen of the United States, we're claiming to be a federal citizen. Okay? We're paying that tax when we shouldn't. We're paying the fees and the licenses and we're getting driver's license and registering our vehicles when we're not federal citizens. We are not supposed to have to pay that tax. Okay? It says federal agencies with respect to the same subject vary extremely from agency to agency without apparent basis, and that the federal government, the states, residents of the federal areas, and others are all suffering serious disabilities and disadvantages because of a general lack of knowledge or understanding of the subject of federal legislative jurisdiction and its consequences. So when I look through GSA, some of the older contracting books, GSA is the General Services Administration. They're the ones with the federal offices that take care of all the general contracts between the states and the feds and the Department of Defense and the various agencies to supply for real estate and services and all the things that the federal people need. And so they have books on how their employees are supposed to contract, and in one of these books, probably all of them, it tells you how to read the codes, what the jurisdictions are, and all these other things. So in there, they have a sheet of paper that has the 5 jurisdictions on it. One of them I keep forgetting. It's exclusive, proprietorial, like a common jurisdiction, and then unknown, and one other one, and I don't recall what it is. But there's 5 types of jurisdiction, and you have exclusive, which means the federal government is the exclusive legislators, lawmaking body of the federal lands. And then you have like concurrent, that's what it is. And that's over the highways. So you have the state, you have Texas, which allows the federal government to use the highways. But in order for them to use the highways, they needed to pay something for it. So the state of Texas, which is the contractor, the law enforcement, which laws are written in contracts. The Constitution is a contract. It's got the laws written in it. But then when they made these other laws, these other contracts, they put more laws inside those contracts. And so now you have contract laws. So now you needed another law enforcement body outside of the Constitution to administer the contracts between the state and the federal government. And that's the law enforcement offices called State of Texas. So when you go and you register your vehicle and you're paying that tax, you're claiming that you're a citizen of the United States. If you look at the form, it'll ask you, are you a citizen of the United States? At least it does on the State of Texas driver's license application. It asks you, are you a citizen of the United States? Yes or no? If you're not, then you don't get a driver's license because you're not supposed to pay that tax. Because you're not supposed to pay to use the roads because you're already paying the tax. In Texas, we pay a sales tax. We pay it on our gasoline. We pay it on our, when we buy our homes. We pay it when we go to the store and we buy clothes and other things. So we already pay our tax. We're not supposed to have to pay another tax for other individual things, but the federal citizens who want to use these things, who don't pay the tax, because the feds are exempt from state taxes. I know because when I worked for the Department of Defense, I ran my department's credit card program. So if I wanted to go to Walmart and purchase some stuff for my office, my federal office, I would get a tax exemption number from Walmart. And then whenever I went to buy stuff, I would go to the customer service desk and I would put in my, I would give them my paper, my certificate, saying that I was tax exempt because I was buying things for the federal government, because the federal government already paid a tax, okay? And the federal government doesn't pay the tax to Walmart. The state citizens do. State citizens pay the tax to Walmart when they buy stuff, and it's supposed to go back to the state, but you see Walmart now is registered with the federal government. So if you look at reginfo.gov, it talks about the various large corporations that are operating in several states and how they go to the Department of Treasury and they have meetings with IRS agents and they agree on how much taxes they're going to pay. Okay, well, they don't just agree on what they're going to pay. They have to then collect that money from their employees individually. And the employees pay Walmart's tax to the federal government. Okay, so they collect the tax from the employees and then they give it to the federal government. Okay. But when I worked for the Department of Defense and I ran the credit card program, I would get my tax exemption number from Walmart or from Office Depot or whatever business we were doing business with, and I would not be charged a tax for anything I purchased from them as a federal person. So it wasn't for personal use, it was for the office, okay? For printers, paper, printer ink, coffee, because we were allowed to purchase coffee so that people who come into our office can have a cup of coffee. It's just like a courtesy thing. We made a lot of purchases for training materials, uniforms, gas masks, various types of PPE that was from a company that was operating in the state. So we would be tax exempt. Okay, so when we purchased things from them, we were tax exempt. Otherwise, the feds would be paying 2 taxes, which is what we do when we claim to be federal citizens. We're paying tax to the state and we're paying a tax to the federal government. Okay, we need to stop claiming to be federal citizens of the United States. Those are military people or their dependents. Okay, we are private citizens or citizens of the states. You can be both, but you don't have to be both. There's nothing that says you have to be both. Okay, I took an oath when I was in the military, but after that, and I got out of the military, I'm not bound to serve anymore. I'm not bound to that oath. Okay, and it kills me a little bit inside when people say they have a Bill of Rights, their constitutional rights. You don't have constitutional rights if you don't have an oath. That's ridiculous. That's idiot thinking. I don't know why people think this. You have all your rights. That's what they're there for. That's what they give up their rights for, so that you can have all of yours. Okay, so we can have all of our natural rights and we can practice all of our liberties and our freedoms. All we have to do is just don't hurt each other, and we're fine. We're free. Okay. This report is on Hathi Trust, HATHITRUST.org, part 1 and 2. It's real easy to find. You can also find it on archive.org. You can search it and find the copy that someone typed. It's got a lot of errors, but why do that when you can just find the original? I like to look at the originals. You can get this from nationalatlas.gov, which is from the Department of Interior. Okay, it'll tell you, you can look up your state and it'll tell you where the federal areas are. Okay, now page 1 of the report of part 1, jurisdiction over federal areas within the state. Just read the first page of chapter 1. Just read that. Just read that and I'm trying to understand everything that it's saying, and you'll basically know what the rest of the whole 2 books say. Okay? You can go online and look up the jurisdictions, federal jurisdictions. It'll tell you all 5 of them. If you can't find them, try looking on Hathi Trust. I know they're on there. General Services Administration contract laws. And if you search through some of those books, you'll find the list of jurisdictions that the federal government has and the ones that they have with the state. It's really not hard to understand any of this. It's only difficult to stop believing the lies that you've been told because we've believed them for so long. Okay? I've been researching this with a good friend for years and years, and we both come to the same conclusion. We both come to find the same things. There's tons of court cases, there's tons of books, there's tons of reports, and then once you understand this and then you go back and you read the laws, they take on a whole nother life. They mean something completely different than what you thought, and they make a whole lot more sense. Okay, so I'm at 55 minutes. I'm gonna call it quits. Please like, share, subscribe. If you can share these videos on Facebook or Rumble or wherever you go nowadays, I would appreciate it, not so much for me, but because you never know who you're gonna help just by sharing something. And it's real easy to do. It doesn't cost anything. You just share it. It takes a couple seconds. You can leave comments. For some reason, my comments are turned off. I don't know why. I don't know how to get them back on. I'll work on that. But you guys have a great day. Be kind to each other and do no harm, as Ron Paul always says. And be safe.